There is a man at the top of a ziggurat right now, not literally, but you know him. You've probably been him, and he is building something. A career, a platform, a reputation, a following. He is pouring everything into it. Underneath all the strategy and the hustle, there is a question he cannot quite name but cannot stop answering. Will I matter? Will anyone remember that I was here? That question is not new. It is ancient, and Genesis 11 is the oldest answer in the world to it. But here is what this chapter is not about. It is not a story about language, and it is not really even a story about a tower. It is a story about two ways of getting a name. You can manufacture one, or God can give you one. Genesis 11 shows you, in 9 surgical verses, exactly what happens when humanity tries the first option, and then a genealogy quietly demonstrates the second. The spine of this whole chapter, the thing the narrator wants you to feel is this. The people of Babel said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." 6 verses later, the text transitions to a genealogy that ends with a man named Abram. God is about to say something about him that lands like thunder. I will make your name great. Genesis 12:2. There are 2 chapters, 2 names, and 2 completely different hands holding the pen. To feel the full weight of that contrast, you have to understand where we are in the biblical story. Genesis 11 sits at a hinge point, the end of chapters 1 through 11. These chapters are the story of the whole human race, from creation through the flood and its aftermath. Starting in chapter 12, the lens narrows dramatically to one man, one family, one covenant line. Genesis 11 is the last chapter of the universal history and the first breath of the particular one. It is where humanity's story as a whole gives way to Israel's story, which is ultimately Christ's story. The setting is the plain of Shinar, what we now know as Mesopotamia, the region of modern-day Iraq. Scholars have long connected the ziggurat described here with the great step temples of ancient Babylon. These were massive, multi-story tower structures built as thresholds between earth and the heavens. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed he had actually seen the Tower of Babel still standing in his day, though clearly in ruin by then. The Babylonians called their own great ziggurat Etemenanki, which in Sumerian means temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. That name matters because the builders of Genesis 11 were making exactly that kind of claim for their project. It was a structure that bridges the divine and the human, with humanity holding the blueprints. And they had one advantage the builders of every previous generation lacked. They all spoke the same language. The Hebrew in verse 1 is striking. The whole earth was of one Safa. Safa literally means lip, not just language in the abstract, but the physical instrument of speech. The whole earth had one lip, one way of forming words, one common code. And then verse 1 adds another phrase, one devarim, one set of words, or more literally, one set of things said. This is not just shared vocabulary, but shared meaning. It is important because the author of Genesis is about to build an entire story on the theme of language. The unity at verse 1 will be the undoing at verse 7. In between, the people will use that one shared language to say something that sets the whole disaster in motion. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower, with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11:4. Shem, that word means a name, a reputation, a self. The Hebrew Shem is not just a label on a door. In ancient Near Eastern thought, your Shem was your existence, your honor, your ongoing presence in the world. The temple in Jerusalem was said to house God's Shem, his name, his very self. 2 Chronicles 7:16. To have a name was to be real, to be counted, to endure. And here is the layered joke. The narrator has buried in this story the genealogy that follows in the second half of Genesis 11. That genealogy begins in verse 10 with the words, "These are the generations of Shem, the son of Noah." Shem's name is literally the Hebrew word for name. The builders of Babel are scrambling to manufacture a Shem, and right below them on the page is Shem himself. The ancestor of Abraham is the man through whom God will give what Babel tried to grab. The irony is not accidental, it is architecture. Scholars who studied the structure of Genesis 11 to 1:9 have noted that it is written as a chiasm. It is a literary form common in ancient Hebrew writing where the structure folds back on itself like a mirror. In a chiasm, the first element corresponds to the last. The second corresponds to the second to last, and so on, with the most important idea placed at the center. Here is how the chiasm works. In this passage, A, the whole earth had one language, verse 1. B, they found a plain and settled there, verse 2. C, come, let us make bricks. C is verse 3. D, come, let us build a city and tower. Let us make a name, lest we be scattered. D is verse 4. E, and the Lord came down to see. Verse 5 is the turning point. D, come. Let us go down and confuse their language. Verses 6, 7. C, so the Lord confused their language. C is verse 8. Ba, from there he scattered them. Verse 9a. A, the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. Verse 9b. Everything in the story hinges on verse 5. That is the center, the turning point, the pivot. And what is in verse 5? 4 words. The Lord came down. Think about what the narrator is doing with this. The people have built a tower whose top reaches to the heavens. They have engineered something so magnificent, it will give them divine proximity, and God has to come down to see it. He cannot even see it from where he actually is. The thing they call the gateway to heaven, God has to stoop to observe. The irony is so sharp it nearly cuts. As scholar David Allen observes, this is sarcasm at an architectural level. Their passionate quest for unity led directly to their scattering. Their worst fears were realized because of what they built. To prevent them, they sought a great name but ended up with a humiliating one. The word for what God does to their language is balal, meaning to mix, to confuse, to pour together in disorder. And from Balal comes Babel. The Babylonians called their city Babalu, Gate of God, a name that rang with prestige and divine connection. But the Hebrew narrator turns it inside out. In Hebrew, Babel sounds like Balal, not the gate of God, the house of confusion. It was the place where you went to become immortal and left unable to speak to your neighbor. They wanted to build a monument to their own permanence, and the only thing that survived was the name of their failure. And the Hebrew of this story is doing even more work than most translations let you see in verse 3. The people say, come, let us make bricks. The Hebrew phrase is Hava Nilvana Levanim. Notice the sounds Nilvana Levanim in Hebrew. This is near alliterative, the words cascading with the same consonants. The author is making the language of the building project sound smooth, efficient, and unified. One lip, one vocabulary, one project, one rhythm. Then in verse 7, God says, come, let us go down and confuse their language. The word confuse, there is a form of balal. If you take the phrase, let us make bricks, nilbana levanim, and reverse its consonants, it sounds remarkably similar to Nabila. Nabila is related to foolishness and ruin. As scholar Alan P. Ross observes, the construction on earth is answered by the deconstruction from heaven, and the Hebrew almost performs it phonetically. There is also the word Levana brick. It shares a root with Lavan white and echoes the name Laban, the slippery character who will deceive Jacob generations later. Bricks are human-manufactured substitutes for stone. The narrator even tells you this directly in verse 3. They had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Real stone comes from the ground, shaped by time and nature. Brick is fired in a kiln, manufactured and controlled. You make bricks, you find stone. And the people of Shinar are building with made things, human products and controlled ingredients. This is an entirely self-sourced project with no raw material that did not first pass through human hands. God builds with stone. Humanity builds with brick. The difference is not just construction technique. It is a theology of dependence. You start seeing this everywhere once you notice it. The tabernacle in the wilderness and the altar instructions in Exodus 20:25. God is specific. Do not dress the stones with a tool. They must be uncut, unmanufactured. When human hands start shaping the sacred, something gets lost. Now, here is the piece of this story that most readings leave out entirely, because they stop at verse 9. The second half of Genesis 11 is a genealogy, 10 names from Shem to Abram. And most people skip it. It reads like a waiting room, but it is actually the resolution that the first half is crying out for. Look at what the genealogy does structurally. It runs from Shem, whose name means name, straight to Abram, whose name the text will rename at the beginning of Genesis 17 as Abraham. But before the rename, we get Genesis 12 to 1 to 3, the call of Abraham, and in that call, God says 5 things he will do. Every single verb has God as the subject, not Abraham. I will make, I will bless, I will make your name great. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who dishonor you. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Genesis 12 to 3. The contrast is the entire point at Babel. Let us make a name for ourselves. In Genesis 12, God says, I will make your name great. At Babel, the verb belongs to humanity. In Genesis 12, the verb belongs to God. At Babel, the people are afraid of being scattered. God scatters them anyway. With Abraham, God calls him to leave, to be scattered from his homeland. And he promises that, from his scattering, something will emerge that blesses the entire earth. This is the genealogy of Shem. This is the corridor between these two scenes. It is God threading history like a needle, preserving one line through the chaos of Babel. It narrows from the whole scattered human race down to one specific man in one specific city. That man will become the father of a people who will bear the name of God into the world. The scattered nations needed to be gathered. They just couldn't do it by building. The people of Babel were not stupid. They were scared, afraid of being dispersed, of being forgotten, of mattering to no one. They did what frightened people do. They built something they could control, something they made with their own hands. It was something they could point to and say, we were here. That impulse to build against our own insignificance hasn't gone away. It just uses different materials now. For instance, Waverly is 34. She runs a small business and creates content networks obsessively. She checks her engagement metrics every morning before her feet hit the floor. She is not vain, not in the shallow sense. She is terrified. Terrified that she will build a life and no one will notice that she will be forgettable. She is terrified that the world will not register that she passed through it. Everything she builds is secretly a tower, not toward heaven exactly, but toward permanence. She is the most hardworking person she knows, and she is exhausted in a way she cannot explain to anyone. The Pentecost account in Acts 2 is the explicit answer to Genesis 11. The New Testament authors knew it. At Babel, one language becomes many, and the nations scatter at Pentecost. People of many languages hear the gospel, each in their own tongue, and they are gathered, as Acts 2 to 6 to 11 records. What God breaks apart in judgment, he reassembles in grace, not through human engineering, but through the Spirit descending. The tower went up, the Spirit came down. Both movements are vertical, but one is humanity reaching for what only God can give. The other is God giving what humanity could never reach. And the irony runs even deeper in Revelation. The last pages of Scripture depict a city not Babylon, but the New Jerusalem descending from heaven. Revelation 21 to 2. It is not a city built upward by human hands to secure a name. It is a city built by God, descending from above. It is given as a gift, and in that city, according to Revelation 2:17, there is a white stone with a new name on it. It is known only between the one who gives it and the one who receives it. It is a name that is not manufactured. It is a name that is given. The builders of Babel wanted a name so badly that they constructed the ancient world's greatest monument to get it. God's answer across the entire sweep of Scripture is this: you cannot build your way to a name that lasts. You can only receive it. If you have been sitting with any part of this, you may have wondered how the whole Bible fits together the way it does. These threads run from Genesis to Revelation, and everything connects. This kind of study changes how you read everything. You start seeing it in texts you thought you already knew. If that resonates, pass this on to someone who asks the same questions you do. There is a word in Genesis 11:4 that gets translated, "lest we be scattered," but deserves a closer look. The Hebrew is pen nephits, from the root puts, meaning to break apart, to shatter, to be dispersed like fragments. The people use it to express their fear. They do not want to be nephits. They want cohesion, a center, a city to hold them together. But here is the deep irony that the text is setting up. God had already told humanity to fill the earth twice, in Genesis 1:28 and again in Genesis 9:1 after the flood. The scattering was always the plan. The diversification of humanity across the face of the earth was always the design. The people at Babel were not just building against their own fear, they were building against the explicit will of God. They were trying to undo the mandate to fill the earth by concentrating into one place under one human vision. And the thing they feared most, pen nephews, became exactly what happened. This was not an arbitrary punishment, but the unavoidable consequence of trying to engineer your own permanence against the grain of the universe. What you try hardest to prevent through self-will is often exactly what self-will brings about. And seeing that destructive loop in our own lives is often the first step toward freedom. It was for Waverly. She went to see a therapist, not because she was falling apart, but because a friend, one she trusted, told her she seemed unreachable. It seemed like she was always somewhere else, even when she was in the room. The therapist asked her what she was afraid would happen if she stopped building. She could not answer for almost 2 full sessions. Then one afternoon she said it out loud. "I think I'm afraid that God doesn't notice me, so I'm trying to make it impossible for the world not to." The therapist did not tell her to pray more. She said something simpler. "You're trying to make a name for yourself because you don't believe anyone will give you one." Waverly drove home and sat in her car. She thought about a man. He was told to leave everything he knew and go somewhere he had never been. He was told not to build his way to significance, but to simply go, and that in the going, the name would follow. She does not have it figured out, but she has started sleeping through the morning without checking her phone. That is not a small thing. Sometimes the healing is not a revelation. Sometimes it is just the long, slow releasing of what you were gripping so hard. That shift from building to receiving is the quiet revolution at the heart of the gospel. It's a journey we're all on in some way. What's one area of your life where you feel the pressure to make a name for yourself? So what does Genesis 11 ask of you this week? First, identify what you are building as a monument to your own permanence. Not all building is bad. Genesis 11 does not condemn work or cities or ambition. But some of what we construct is secretly a Babel project. A hustle to prove we exist. A performance designed to make ourselves unforgettable. Name it honestly, not to feel guilty. But because you cannot release what you will not name. Second, sit with Genesis 12:2 and let God's verb do its work. I will make your name great. In your Bible, underline every "I will" in God's speech to Abraham and count the verbs. God is the active subject of Abraham's story. Abraham's job was not to secure the outcome, it was to go. Ask yourself where God might be calling you to simply go, trusting that the name is His to give and not yours to manufacture. Third, trace the genealogy of Shem in Genesis 11:10 through 26. Slowly, 10 names, 10 generations. None of them were famous, most of them were forgotten, but every single one of them was a link in a chain. That chain ended with Abraham, then with Isaac, then with Jacob, then with David, then with Jesus. Your obscurity is not evidence that you have been forgotten. It may be evidence that you are inside something larger than you can see. So we have seen the core choice of Genesis 11, to manufacture a name for yourself or to receive one from God. We saw how the builders of Babel, in their fear, tried to build their way to permanence. They did so with bricks and bitumen, only to have their language and their project confused. We traced the word Shem, or name, from their desperate grasp to the quiet genealogy of Shem himself. And we saw how that genealogy leads directly to Abram, a man who was given the great name that Babel could never construct. This week, remember the choice. You can build or you can receive. The builders of Babel looked up at their tower and saw permanence. God looked down at their tower and saw how small it was. The difference was not the height of the structure, it was who was doing the looking. Genesis 11 ends not with the confusion of languages but with a genealogy. 10 quiet names in a row, each one a generation of faithfulness. Each one carried a name that mattered not because they built something, but because they were in something. The same Shem, whose name means name, threads through all of them. At the end of the corridor stands Abram with a barren wife at his side. There is no city, no monument, no tower. He waits for a word from outside himself to tell him who he is. The word came, and nothing built by human hands has ever outlasted it.